Alright, so let's get started. So this is Revo, and in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make some assets for UDK, and I will try to explain everything in detail, but I won't tell as much as you would think I would tell, because I will left out some parts which are unnecessary, because I assume that you have some basic knowledge for 3ds Max. So first, let's see. Um, so at first, you have to have an idea what you want to do. In my case, I just searched for a basic door, which I will model later on. But this can be anything. So it can be a reference from Google, an image taken from a movie, etc. So it can be anything. It doesn't matter what reference image are you using, or if you're not a beginner and you can models from freely from just your imagination, that's even better, because you do not have to set up a reference image in order to model your 3D object. But in my case, I just made a search for one. And yes, so before I start that door to model it in Max, I have to first design the topology. That means I have to lay out the basics of its surface, how the faces will be placed, and by not skipping this step would mean that I will be able to model the actual object much faster in Max without to having to think that how the mesh flow would work. So it's a much easier thing to do. So keep in mind that if you want to, how should I put it? If you want to ease up your workflow, then this is a very good solution to start with. So anyway, I just made a quick paint over that I highlighted these areas which I want to keep intact, which means that I have to keep this geometry intact, because if I do move these vertices for here or here, it wouldn't make the end result or the desired result what I want to achieve. So I cannot touch these objects. So what should we do next? So first we have to make sure that this object is a fairly quad-based object, because quads are better for subdivision, and if you want to make a high poly model out of this low poly later on, you have to subdivide your surface, and quads are the best option for subdivision. If you have triangles, you will get into problems, so it's better just to have quads on your mesh. It's acceptable that you can have some triangles, which I will show later on, or you can have more than 4 or 5-sided objects, but the quad is the best option for subdivision. So at first you see that if you just would do another paint over on it to design the faces for this object, you would see that you have some serious mesh flow problems. As you can see, it has quads like this area, or triangles like this area or this, and if you want to subdivide this surface right away, it would cause some bad subdivision, so it would cause some errors. So this is the particular example that if you do not make a pre not render but pre-made topology for your mesh, you avoid these problems. So just let's quickly erase this and see what we can do else. So now you can see that you have to avoid some particular areas to make them quad based. So let's see. Okay, so first I try to optimize the previous laid out um, topology, and as you can see I've tried to use as many quads as I could over here in the top section, in the middle part, but unfortunately, and this in this lower part, but unfortunately I had to use triangles because I could not make it otherwise. So I will highlight those in a minute. So as you can see I had to use 4 triangles, but it's acceptable because it won't cause much problems because they are not the first thing is that they are on a flat surface, so they won't bend, so that's a good thing, and I can subdivide it without having problems. So it's acceptable that you can use triangles, but not so don't overdo it. Okay, so the next thing it would be that if we are happy with the desired outcome, we can start to model it in Max. So let's see the next step. So first, what I do is after I created the topology, I create a plane, assign a material to it, and I put this image onto it, and I just simply start to model out that object in 2D, and the end result would look like something like this. As you can see, it's just a pretty It's just a pretty same copy of the image I've just drew. So nothing has changed on it. You can still find some. Oh yeah, I think I changed 2 things. That I just left only 2 triangles, and I made 2 quads instead of these 2 triangles, but it's pretty much the same. So it took me like, I don't know, 10 minutes, but the 10 minutes is because I tried to maintain this shape as not perfect, but as symmetrical as possible. So I mean that I tried to use even-sided objects. So it was a bit hard to model, but if it would be a much easier model, then it would take me like under 2 minutes because I just would quickly model it in. So anyway, after this, I just simply made a 3D model out of this 2D plane, which would look something like this. I just extruded these areas, which I'm showing right now, and on the side view it looks like something like this. So it's nothing new. The interesting part would come after this, because we have to design the high poly base. But before I go further, I should mention that I've seen some forums which mention that some used to start with high poly and then later on decrease the poly count to make the low poly out of it, or some just start with the low poly and then increase it to make it high poly. But even though if you do that from high to low or low to high, you can get some problems. You can run into some problems because from making for example, if you try to make a high poly to a low poly, it would take so much time, and it's a pain in the ass process. And if you do it vice versa, it's a pain in the ass as well, because if I just quickly go back, and if I show you that if I would use this simple object or much simplified version, because I can simplify this much more. I cannot subdivide it as much as I could or I wanted to, because I would run into problems. So it's not the best solution. So what I use is I just make an optimized version. As you can see, an optimized oops, let's go back. An optimized version of this low poly. So it can be increased. So I can put loops in it without having difficulties subdividing it, or I can just decrease it to make the low poly base, the extreme low poly. So this is just the middle part between the extremely low and extremely high poly. So I would just start with this, so I can easily create a high poly out of this, and then if I finish with the high poly, I just decrease this and I'm done with the low poly, and I save time and I just avoid frustrations because I can do it in a pretty quick way. So as you can see, I created the high poly base, which means that I can just put turbo smooth on it, or I can use the editable poly subdivision mode, and I use that. So this means that I just put some support edges wherever I wanted to keep the mesh flow, and I will just increase the subdivision, and you will see that I will get pretty smooth end result out of it. And you can see the triangle count is over, it's almost 2000, and you will see that the end result, the end low poly, would be so much smaller. So let's see the extreme high poly. Even though this is a very simple object, I used 126,000 for, if I want to be precise, 402 triangles. So it's 126,000, and as you can see, it has no smoothing errors. I try to avoid things that will cause smoothing errors, and because I used only quads, I was one step ahead of me. And by achieving this final object, now I only have to do that. I have to decrease my previously showed middle level object to decrease it to an extremely low poly object. So I'm going to show you that. So yeah, you can see that I wrote that optimize as much as possible, because the triangle counts, not just counts in how much triangles do you render within your engine, but it counts that how good will it look like, and it's a serious thing to keep in mind, that you have to keep the object intact without decreasing its shape. So as you can see, I try to optimize my mid poly, if I can say that, and you can see that I used several triangles, and my triangle count was decreased to 175. So this is the final object which will be in game if I would put it in UDK, for example, and all the higher details which you can see in the high poly would be just a texture on it. Okay, so let's move on to step 5. UVW unwraps. Well, this is the worst part of all, because the better you get in modeling, the more not difficult, but the more complex objects you make, and that will mean that the unwrapping process will increase because you will have more bits to unwrap. So it's a very tedious thing to do.